Fatal Fever, Chapter 7. Pursuit. She came out fighting and swearing, both of which she could do with appalling efficiency and vigor. Herman Biggs read the report on his desk with dismay. A typhoid carrier could threaten the city that he had worked so hard to protect. Because the report came from George Soper, Biggs took it seriously. He knew all about Soper's work as an epidemiologist and sanitary engineer, including during the 1903 Ithaca outbreak. Biggs had been born and raised near Ithaca, where he attended high school before entering Cornell University. His brother and uncle were Ithaca physicians who had seen the epidemic firsthand. This uncle had inspired Biggs to go to medical school in the early 1880s. Herman Biggs believed in a principle that drove him to devote his life to public health. Disease is largely a removable evil. Now, 47, he had been the general medical officer for New York City's health department since 1902. Biggs had worked with each commissioner to build the best health department in the United States. It had to be. Contagious diseases surged through the city's crowded tenement and shanty towns. The immigrant-filled neighborhoods were bulging with more than 200,000 people living in each square mile. That was the same number of residents in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a 50-square-mile city. 10 years before Biggs became the general medical officer, he established a bacteriology laboratory at the health department. Using the latest methods, the bacteriologist studied the microbes that caused lethal contagious diseases such as cholera, diphtheria, smallpox, and tuberculosis. By identifying microorganisms found in the sick, the laboratory diagnosed diseases quickly. That helped the health department treat patients and control outbreaks. This laboratory would test Mary Mallon for typhoid. Herman Biggs assigned the task of obtaining Mallon's body specimens to Dr. Walter Bensel, the man in charge of the health department's medical inspectors. Inspectors combed the city, on the watch for unhealthy people who should be treated or isolated before they infected anyone else. Bensel decided that Mary Mallon might be more cooperative if a female inspector asked for her specimens. He had someone in mind, his assistant, Dr. S. Josephine Baker. Joe. Sarah Josephine Baker's life might have been different if Poughkeepsie, New York, had filtered its drinking water. But instead of following the same path as her mother, attending Vassar College, marrying well, and having several children, Jo watched her life abruptly change direction when she was 16. In spring 1890, Jo's prosperous lawyer father contracted typhoid fever and died. He wasn't the first, or the last, in the city to die that way. Typhoid outbreaks were common in Poughkeepsie, which was located on the Hudson River just below an insane asylum's sewer outlet. Dr. Baker's death left Jo, her semi-invalid sister, and her mother with a house to live in but not enough savings to support them for so long. Jo realized that it would be up to her to earn a living for her family when the cash ran out. She decided that a professional career was the best way to bring in money. Attending Vassar College in Poughkeepsie was no longer an option. College would delay her professional training by several years. She was never quite sure what led her to choose medicine. No one in the family had been a doctor, and both sides of the family were aghast at her plans. Few women went into medicine, and Jo knew that the world would not wholly approve of them. She later said that when friends and family tried to talk her out of it, her stubbornness made her go ahead, at all costs, and in spite of everyone. Jo heard about a Manhattan school that accepted women, the Women's Medical College of New York Infirmary. Most medical schools did not require a 4-year college degree, and she was able to enroll with only her high school education. After paying her tuition with much of the money her father had left, Jo moved into a boarding house and prepared for classes to start. She worried that she'd made a mistake and wasted the family savings. Yet once she began her medical studies, Jo knew that it was the one thing of all others that I will and must do. A new doctor. In the spring of 1898, 24-year-old Dr. S. Josephine Baker graduated second in her class of 18. She headed to Boston for her internship. While Baker was working at a clinic that served the Boston slums, she was called to deliver a baby. When she arrived at the tenement apartment, she found a woman in labor lying in a pile of straw. 4 little children cowered nearby. The drunken husband was sprawled on the floor. Nice. As Baker began attending to the mother, she noticed that the woman's back was badly burned. The woman told Baker her husband had thrown a kettle of scalding water over her a few days before. Nice guy. Shouting obscenities, the furious husband pushed himself up and staggered toward the young doctor. Baker had to do something about him, though he weighed twice as much as she did. I can think of a lot of things that should be done. She ran toward the apartment door, and the man followed, yelling and cursing at her. When he came close enough, she punched him as hard as she could. Good for her. Already nearly too drunk to stand, the man fell backward out of the apartment. Baker slammed the door behind him, blocked it with furniture, and delivered the baby. My kind of doctor. Josephine Baker had come a long way from her quiet, privileged upbringing in Poughkeepsie. When her Boston internship ended, Baker returned to New York City to start her own practice. Her former professors advised against it. They recommended moving to a smaller community like her hometown of Poughkeepsie, where she'd find less competition for patients. But Baker was determined. She had enjoyed living in Manhattan while she was in school, and she wanted to stay. Disregarding the advice, she and a medical school friend opened an office in New York's Upper West Side. Being female physicians turned out to be an advantage. Many women preferred to be examined and treated by a woman doctor, and New York had few of them. Most of the families that came to the office, however, couldn't afford to pay much for their medical care. Baker struggled to make a living. The Inspector. One day in 1901, she heard that New York City's health department was hiring medical inspectors. The salary was $30 a month, which sounded good to Baker after making half that rate in her medical practice. Since the position was only part-time, she would still be able to treat her own patients. Baker applied. She was hired to inspect school children for head lice, eye infections, and contagious skin diseases such as ringworm and scabies. Before long, Baker became frustrated. She didn't have time to examine each child adequately, and she doubted that the infected children she sent home ever received the required follow-up visit by another inspector. Baker discovered that the health department was full of political appointees who did little or no work. It reeked of negligence and stale tobacco smoke and slacking, she observed with disgust. She vowed to quit and return to her medical practice full-time. Then, in November 1901, a new mayor was elected. He appointed a different health commissioner and made Herman Biggs the general medical officer. The whole department shuddered at the shakeup and house cleaning that occurred, Baker later wrote. She was pleased with the fresh dedication, efficiency, and honesty. When her new supervisor, Walter Bensel, offered to raise her salary to $100 a month, she decided to stay. For the next few years, Baker was a roving medical inspector. She visited the tenements where she often found a dozen people living in one room. I climbed stair after stair, knocked on door after door, and met drunk after drunk. Filthy mother after filthy mother and dying baby after dying baby, she recalled. There was no dodging the hopelessness of it all. She was shocked to learn that a third of the slum children never lived to age 5. Each week in the summer, 1,500 of the city's babies died, many from dysentery caused by drinking contaminated milk or water. Baker decided that something could and must be done about the mass of misery. She didn't yet know how, but she would find a way to change these terrible conditions. The brownstone on Park Avenue. On Monday, March 18, 1907, 1 week after George Soper alerted the health department, Medical Inspector Josephine Baker was on her way to visit the suspected typhoid carrier. If the cook, Mary Mallon, was truly a carrier, Baker knew how crucial it was to test her. The health department had enough trouble controlling typhoid outbreaks caused by polluted water and food. The last thing the city needed was a silent human carrier adding to its bubbling cauldron of germs. That's quite the metaphor. When Baker reached the Bone home on Park Street Avenue, she asked to speak with the cook. She was shown to the kitchen where she found Mary Mallon hard at work. Baker's first impression was that Mary was a clean, neat, obviously self-respecting Irishwoman. Baker was used to discussing health matters with immigrants, many of whom distrusted government and hospitals. She was careful in her choice of words so that she didn't sound accusing or threatening, but there was no way around bluntly asking for a sample of the cook's blood and urine. Mary Mallon's response was clear and definite. No. Her glowering eyes and firm voice told Baker that no amount of coaxing and reasoning would change Mallon's mind. Why hadn't anyone warned her that this woman might resist the testing request? Empty-handed, Baker returned to the New York City Department of Health on 6th Avenue. Walter Bensel repeated his instructions. Mary Mallon absolutely must provide specimens of her blood and urine for typhoid testing. He told Baker to go back to the brownstone the next day. Bensel arranged for an ambulance and some policemen to go with her this time. He said that if Mary resisted, they were to take her to the Willard Parker Hospital, by force if necessary. The chase. The next morning dawned with snow and dampness in the air, the most miserable kind of weather that March could offer. Baker pulled on a warm coat and headed back to Park Avenue. By 7:30 a.m., she had arrived at the corner near the Bone House, where the horse-drawn ambulance was already waiting. She hoped that Mallon would cooperate when she saw the policeman. In case she didn't, Baker thought it wise to cut off possible escape routes. Clever. She sent one of the 3 officers to the front of the house and another to the closest side street. Then she and the 3rd policeman approached the servants' entrance and knocked. When the cook opened the door, she held a long, sharp kitchen fork. For a moment, Baker wondered whether Mary Mallon had been waiting for them. Suddenly, Mallon thrust the fork toward her. Startled, Baker fell back against the policeman to avoid being stabbed. She realized that this seemingly simple task of obtaining specimens was going to be anything but easy. By the time Baker and the policeman had pushed inside, Mallon was out of sight. The 2 gave chase. Backed by the legal authority of the health and police departments, they went room to room, looking behind furniture and in closets. They couldn't find her, and no one in the household had seen her. Somehow, Mary Mallon had slipped out of the Bone House. While checking the backyard, Mary spotted their first clue: footprints in the snow. The prints led to a fence against which a chair had been propped. She noticed that the snow was brushed away on the top of the fence above the chair. Mallon must have climbed over the neighboring yard. Baker took the hunt to the brownstone next door. After explaining the situation to neighbors, she and the officer searched that house too, basement to attic. Baker asked the servants if the cook from next door had been there. Definitely not, they replied. Mary Mallon had vanished. After nearly 3 hours of futile pursuit, Josephine Baker had failed in her assignment. She'd have to report to Dr. Bensel, and he wasn't going to like the news. Discouraged, Baker walked 2 blocks to 3rd Avenue, where she knew there was a telephone. Every nook and cranny. As she feared, her boss's response over the phone was short and to the point. "I expect you to get the specimens or to take Mary to the hospital." Baker would have to try again. She figured out that Mallon couldn't have gone far. The cook hadn't had time to grab a coat when she fled, and if she escaped to the street, the police officers would have seen her. For Baker to have any chance of finding Mallon, she needed more help. On the way back to the Bones brownstone, Baker saw 2 other policemen on the street, and she took them with her. With these extra men joining in, Baker and the officers searched inside both houses again. "For another 2 hours we went through every closet, nook, and cranny," Baker later recalled. It was utter defeat. As they were leaving through the basement door of the second house, one of the officers nudged Baker. He pointed to a small outside closet under the front stairway. A piece of blue cotton fabric was stuck in the door. They hadn't noticed the colorful fragment before because it was partly hidden behind several ash cans piled in front of the closet. The policeman moved the cans away and yanked open the door. A blonde woman wearing a blue dress and white apron was crouched in the closet. Mary Mallon. She came out fighting and swearing, both of which she could do with appalling efficiency and vigor, Baker later wrote. She ignored the cook's rage. She had a job to do. The health department needed to test Mallon for typhoid fever. Baker told the woman it was very important for her to provide urine and blood samples. Mallon loudly and adamantly refused. Why were they persecuting her? She didn't have typhoid and never had. Why didn't they believe her? With the woman in the agitated state, Baker knew she couldn't get the samples. They would have to take Mallon to Willard Parker, the contagious disease hospital near the East River. Mallon yelled and kicked as the policeman carried her to the ambulance and forced her inside. Even after the doors closed, she kept fighting. With Mallon thrashing and screaming, Baker sat on top of the woman's body to keep her from breaking away. The bumpy 3-mile ride downtown to the hospital felt to Josephine Baker like being in a cage with an angry lion. She didn't mind. The chase was over and they had caught Mary Mallon.